The Man Who Loved Islands by D.H. Lawrence, narrated by Tony Walker. There was a man who loved islands. He was born on one, but it didn't suit him, as there were too many other people on it besides himself. He wanted an island all of his own, not necessarily to be alone on it, but to make it a world of his own. An island, if it is big enough, is no better than a continent. It has to be really quite small before it feels like an island. And this story will show how tiny it has to be before you can presume to fill it with your own personality. Now, circumstances so worked out that this lover of islands, by the time he was 35, actually acquired an island of his own. He didn't own it as a freehold property, but he had a 99 years lease of it, which, as far as a man and an island are concerned, is as good as everlasting. Since, if you are like Abraham and want your offspring to be numberless as the sands of the seashore, you don't choose an island to start breeding on. Too soon there would be overpopulation, overcrowding and slum conditions, which is a horrid thought for one who loves an island for its insulation. No, an island is a nest which holds one egg and one only. This egg is the islander himself. The island acquired by our potential islander was not in the remote oceans. It was quite near home. No palm trees, no boom of surf on the reef, nor any of that kind of thing. But a good solid dwelling house, rather gloomy, above the landing place, and beyond a small farmhouse with sheds and a few outlying fields. Down on the little landing bay were 3 cottages in a row like Coast Guard's cottages, all neat and whitewashed. What could be more cosy and homelike? It was 4 miles if you walked all round your island, through the gorse and the blackthorn bushes, above the steep rocks of the sea, and down in the little glades where the primroses grew. If you walked straight over the 2 humps of hills, the length of it, through the rocky fields where the cows lay chewing, and through the rather sparse oats, on into the gorse again, and so to the low cliff's edge, it took you only 20 minutes. And when you came to the edge, you could see another, bigger island lying beyond, but the sea was between you and it. And as you returned over the turf, where the short downland cowslips nodded, you saw to the east still another island, a tiny one this time, like the calf of the cow. This tiny island also belonged to the islander. Thus it seems that even islands like to keep each other company. Our islander loved his island very much. In early spring, the little ways and glades were a snow of blackthorn, a vivid white among the Celtic stillness of the close green and grey rock, blackbirds calling out in the whiteness their first long triumphant calls. After the blackthorn and the nestling primroses came the blue apparition of hyacinths, like elfin lakes and slipping sheets of blue among the bushes and under the glade of trees, and many birds with nests you could peep into, on the island, all your own. Wonderful, what a great world it was. Followed summer, and the cowslips gone, the wild roses faintly fragrant through the haze. There was a field of hay, the foxgloves stood looking down. In the little cove, the sun was on the pale granite where you bathed, and the shadow was in the rocks. Before the mist came stealing, you went home through the ripening oats, the glare of the sea fading from the high air as the foghorn started to moo on the other island. And then the sea fog went. It was autumn, the oat sheaves lying prone. The great moon, another island, rose golden out of the sea, and rising higher, the world of the sea was white. So autumn ended with rain, and winter came. Dark skies and dampness and rain, but rarely frost. The island, your island, cowered dark, holding away from you. You could feel down in the wet, sombre hollows the resentful spirit coiled upon itself, like a wet dog coiled in gloom, or a snake that is neither asleep nor awake. Then in the night, When the wind left off blowing in great gusts and volleys as at sea, you felt that your island was a universe, infinite and old as the darkness, not an island at all, but an infinite dark world where all the souls from all other bygone nights lived on, and the infinite distance was near. Strangely, from your little island in space, you were never gone forth into the great dark realms of time, where all the souls that never die veer and swoop on their vast, strange errands. The little earthly island has dwindled, like a jumping-off place, into nothingness. For you have jumped off, you know not how, into the dark, wide mystery of time, where the past is vastly alive, and the future is not separated off. This is the danger of becoming an islander. When in the city you wear your white spats and dodge the traffic with the fear of death down your spine, then you are quite safe from the terrors of infinite time. The moment is your little islet in time. It is the spatial universe that careers round you. But once isolate yourself on a little island in the sea of space, and the moment begins to heave and expand in great circles, the solid earth is gone, and your slippery, naked, dark soul finds herself out in the timeless world, where the chariots of the so-called dead dash down the old streets of centuries, and souls crowd on the footways that we, in the moment, call bygone years. The souls of all the dead are alive again, and pulsating actively around you. You are out in the other infinity. Something of this happened to our islander. Mysterious feelings came upon him that he wasn't used to, strange awarenesses of old, far-gone men and other influences, men of Gaul with big moustaches who had been on this island and had vanished from the face of it, but not out of the air of night. They were there still, hurtling their big, violent, unseen bodies through the night, and there were priests with golden knives and mistletoe, then other priests with a crucifix, then pirates with murder on the sea. Our islander was uneasy. He didn't believe in the daytime in any of this nonsense, but at night it just was so. He had reduced himself to a single point in space, and a point being that which has neither length nor breadth, he had to step off it into somewhere else, just as you must step into the sea if the waters wash your foothold away. So he had at night to step off into the other worlds of undying time. He was uncannily aware as he lay in the dark that the blackthorn grove that seemed a bit uncanny even in the realm of space and days at night was crying with old men of an invisible race around the altar stone. What was a ruin under the hornbeam trees by day was a moaning of blood-stained priests with crucifixes on the ineffable night. What was a cave and hidden beach between coarse rocks became, in the invisible dark, the purple-lipped imprecation of pirates. To escape any more of this sort of awareness, our islander daily concentrated upon his material island. Why should it not be the happy isle at last? Why not the last small isle of the Hesperides, the perfect place, all filled with his own gracious blossom-like spirit? A minute world of pure perfection made by man himself. He began, as we begin all our attempts to regain paradise, by spending money. The old semi-feudal dwelling house he restored, let in more light, put clear lovely carpets on the floor, clear flower-petal curtains at the sullen windows, and wines in the cellars of rock. He brought over a buxom housekeeper from the world, and a soft-spoken, much-experienced butler. These two were to be islanders. In the farmhouse he put a bailiff with 2 farmhands. There were Jersey cows tinkling a slow bell among the gorse. There was a call to meals at midday, and the peaceful smoking of chimneys at evening when rest descended. A jaunty sailing boat with a motor accessory rode in the shelter of the bay just below the row of 3 white cottages. There was also a little yawl and 2 rowboats drawn up on the sand. A fishing net was drying on its supports. A boatload of new white planks stood criss-cross. A woman was going to the well with a bucket. In the end cottage lived the skipper of the yacht and his wife and son. He was a man from the other large island, at home on this sea. Every fine day he went out fishing with his son. Every fair day there was fresh fish in the island. In the middle cottage lived an old man and wife, a very faithful couple. The old man was a carpenter and man of many jobs. He was always working, always the sound of his plane or his saw lost in his work. He was another kind of islander. In the third cottage was a mason, a widower with a son and 2 daughters. With the help of his boy, this man dug ditches and built fences, raised buttresses and erected a new outbuilding and hewed stone from the little quarry. One daughter worked at the big house. It was a quiet, busy little world. When the islander brought you over as his guest, you met first the dark-bearded, thin, smiling skipper Arnold, then his boy Charles. At the house, the smooth-lipped butler who had lived all over the world valeted you and created that curious, creamy, smooth, disarming sense of luxury around you, which only a perfect and rather untrustworthy servant can create. He disarmed you and had you at his mercy. The buxom housekeeper smiled and treated you with the subtly respectful familiarity that is only dealt out to the true gentry. And the rosy maid threw a glance at you, as if you were very wonderful, coming from the greater outer world. Then you met the smiling but watchful bailiff who came from Cornwall, and the shy farmhand from Berkshire with his clean wife and 2 little children. Then the rather sulky farmhand man from Suffolk. The mason, a Kent man, would talk to you by the yard if you let him. Only the old carpenter was gruff and elsewhere absorbed. Well then, it was a little world to itself, and everybody feeling very safe and being very nice to you, as if you were really something special. But it was the islander's world, not yours. He was the master. The special smile, the special attention was to the master. They all knew how well off they were, so the islander was no longer Mr. So-and-so. To everyone on the island, even to you yourself, he was the master. Well, it was ideal. The master was no tyrant. No. He was a delicate, sensitive, handsome master who wanted everything perfect and everybody happy. Himself, of course, to be the fount of this happiness and perfection. But in his way, he was a poet. He treated his guests royally, his servants liberally, yet he was shrewd and very wise. He never came the boss over his people, yet he kept his eye on everything, like a shrewd, blue-eyed young Hermes. And it was amazing what a lot of knowledge he had at hand. Amazing what he knew about Jersey cows and cheese-making, ditching and fencing, flowers and gardening, ships and the sailing of ships. He was a fount of knowledge about everything, and this knowledge he imparted to his people in an odd, half-ironical, half-portentous fashion, as if he really belonged to the quaint, half-real world of the gods. They listened to him with their hats in their hands. He loved white clothes, or creamy white, and cloaks and broad hats, so in fine weather the bailiff would see the elegant tall figure in creamy white serge coming like some bird over the fallow to look at the weeding of the turnips. Then there would be a doffing of hats and a few minutes of whimsical, shrewd, wise talk, to which the bailiff answered admiringly, and the farmhands listened in silent wonder, leaning on their hoes. The bailiff was almost tender to the master. Or, on a windy morning, he would stand with his cloak blowing in the sticky sea wind on the edge of the ditch that was being dug to drain a little swamp, talking in the teeth of the wind to the man below, who looked up at him with steady and inscrutable eyes. Or at evening in the rain, he would be seen hurrying across the yard, the broad hat turned against the rain. And the farm wife would hurriedly exclaim, "The master! Get up, John, and clear him a place on the sofa." And then the door opened, and it was a cry of, "Why, all things, if it isn't the master! Why have ye turned out then of a night like this, to come across to the like of we?" And the bailiff took his cloak, and the farm wife his hat. The two farm hands drew their chairs to the back. He sat on the sofa, and took a child up near him. He was wonderful with children. Talked to them simply wonderful. "Made you think of our Saviour himself," said the woman. He was always greeted with smiles and the same peculiar deference, as if he were a higher but also frailer being. They handled him almost tenderly and almost with adulation, but when he left, or when they spoke of him, they had often a subtle, mocking smile on their faces. There was no need to be afraid of the master. Just let him have his own way. Only the old carpenter was sometimes sincerely rude to him, so he didn't care for the old man. It's doubtful whether any of them really liked him, man to man, or even woman to man. But then it's doubtful if he really liked any of them as man to man or man to woman. He wanted them to be happy and the little world to be perfect. But anyone who wants the world to be perfect must be careful not to have real likes or dislikes. A general goodwill is all you can afford. The sad fact is, alas, that general goodwill is always felt as something of an insult by the mere object of it, and so it breeds a quite special brand of malice. Surely general goodwill is a form of egoism, that it should have such a result. Our islander, however, had his own resources. He spent long hours in his library, for he was compiling a book of references to all the flowers mentioned in the Greek and Latin authors. He was not a great classical scholar, the usual public school equipment, but there are such excellent translations nowadays. And it was so lovely tracing flower after flower as it blossomed in the ancient world. So the first year on the island passed by. A great deal had been done. Now the bills flooded in, and the master, conscientious in all things, began to study them. The study left him pale and breathless. He was not a rich man. He knew he had been making a hole in his capital to get the island into running order. When he came to look, however, there was hardly anything left but hole. Thousands and thousands of pounds had the island swallowed into nothingness. But surely the bulk of the spending was over. Surely the island must now begin to be self-supporting, even if it made no profit. Surely he was safe. He paid a good many of the bills and took a little heart. But he had had a shock, and the next year, the coming year, there must be economy, frugality. He told his people so in simple and touching language, and they said, "Why, surely, surely." So when the wind blew and the rain lashed outside, he would sit in his library with the bailiff over a pipe and a pot of beer, discussing farm projects. He lifted his narrow, handsome face, and his blue eyes became dreamy. What a wind! It blew like cannon shots. He thought of his island lashed with foam and inaccessible, and he exulted. No, he must not lose it. He turned back to the farm projects with the zest of a genius, and his hands flicked white emphasis, while the bailiff intoned, yes, sir, you're right, master." But the man was hardly listening. He was looking at the master's blue lawn shirt and curious pink tie with the fiery red stone, at the enamel sleeve links, and at the ring with the peculiar scarab. The brown, searching eyes of the man of the soil glanced repeatedly over the fine, immaculate figure of the master, with a sort of slow, calculating wonder. But if he happened to catch the master's bright, exalted glance, his own eye lit up with a careful cordiality and deference as he bowed his head slightly. Thus between them They decided what crops should be sown, what fertilizers should be used in different places, which breed of pigs should be imported, and which line of turkeys. That is to say, the bailiff, by continually cautiously agreeing with the master, kept out of it, and let the young man have his own way. The master knew what he was talking about. He was brilliant at grasping the gist of a book and knowing how to apply this knowledge. On the whole, his ideas were sound. The bailiff even knew it. But in the man of the soil there was no answering enthusiasm. The brown eyes smiled their cordial deference, but the thin lips never changed. The master pursed his own flexible mouth in a boyish versatility as he cleverly sketched in his ideas to the other man, and the bailiff made eyes of admiration, but in his heart he was not attending. He was only watching the master as he would have watched a queer caged animal, quite without sympathy, not implicated. So it was settled, and the master rang for Elvery, the butler, to bring a sandwich. He, the master, was pleased. The butler saw it, and came back with anchovy and ham sandwiches, and a newly opened bottle of vermouth. There was always a newly opened bottle of something. It was the same with the mason. The master and he discussed the drainage of a bit of land, and more pipes were ordered, more special bricks, more this, more that. Fine weather came at last. There was a little lull in the hard work on the island. The master went for a short cruise in his yacht. It was not really a yacht, just a little bit of a thing. They sailed along the coast of the mainland and put in at the ports. At every port some friend turned up. The butler made elegant little meals in the cabin. Then the master was invited to villas and hotels. His people disembarked him as if he were a prince. And oh, how expensive it turned out. He had to telegraph to the bank for money, and he went home again to economize. The marsh marigolds were blazing in the little swamp where the ditches were being dug for drainage. He almost regretted now the work in hand. The yellow beauties would not blaze again. Harvest came, and a bumper crop. There must be a harvest home supper. The long barn was now completely restored and added to. The carpenter had made long tables. Lanterns hung from the beams of the high-pitched roof. All the people of the island were assembled. The bailiff presided. It was a gay scene. Towards the end of the supper, the master, in a velvet jacket, appeared with his guests. Then the bailiff rose and proposed, "The master, long life and health to the master." All the people drank the health with great enthusiasm and cheering. The master replied with a little speech. They were on an island, in a little world of their own. It depended on them all to make this world a world of true happiness and content. Each must do his part. He hoped he himself did what he could, for his heart was in his island, and with the people of his island. The butler responded, "As long as the island had such a master, it could not help but be a little heaven for all the people on it." This was seconded with virile warmth by the bailiff and the mason. The skipper was beside himself. Then there was dancing. The old carpenter was fiddler. But under this, things were not well. The very next morning came the farm boy to say that a cow had fallen over the cliff. The master went to look. He peered over the not very high declivity and saw her lying dead on a green ledge under a bit of late flowering broom, a beautiful, expensive creature, already looking swollen. But what a fool to fall so unnecessarily! It was a question of getting several men to haul her up the bank, and then of skinning and burying her. No one would eat the meat. How repulsive it all was! This was symbolic of the island. As sure as the spirits rose in the human breast with a movement of joy, an invisible hand struck malevolently out of the silence. There must not be any joy, nor even any quiet peace. A man broke a leg, another was crippled with rheumatic fever. The pigs had some strange disease. A storm drove the yacht on a rock. The mason hated the butler and refused to let his daughter serve at the house. Out of the very air came a stony, heavy malevolence. The island itself seemed malicious. It would go on being hurtful and evil for weeks at a time. Then suddenly again, one morning, it would be fair, lovely as a morning in paradise, everything beautiful and flowing, and everybody would begin to feel a great relief and a hope for happiness. Then, as soon as the master was opened out in spirit like an open flower, some ugly blow would fall. Somebody would send him an anonymous note accusing some other person on the island. Somebody else would come hinting things against one of his servants. "Some folks think they've got an easy job out here with all the pickings they make," the mason's daughter screamed at the suave butler in the master's hearing. He pretended not to hear. "My man says this island is surely one of the lean kine of Egypt. It would swallow a sight of money, and you'd never get anything back out of it," confided the farmhand's wife to one of the master's visitors. The people were not contented. They were not islanders. "We feel we're not doing right by our children," said those who had children. "We feel we're not doing right by ourselves," said those who had no children. And the various families fairly came to hate one another. Yet the island was so lovely. When there was a scent of honeysuckle and the moon brightly flickering down on the sea, then even the grumblers felt a strange nostalgia for it. It set you yearning, with a wild yearning, perhaps for the past, to be far back in the mysterious past of the island when the blood had a different throb. Strange floods of passion came over you, strange violent lusts and imaginations of cruelty. The blood and the passion and the lust which the island had known. Uncanny dreams, half-dreams, half-evocated yearnings. The master himself began to be a little afraid of his island. He felt here strange, violent feelings he had never felt before, and lustful desires that he had been quite free from. He knew quite well now that his people didn't love him at all. He knew that their spirits were secretly against him, malicious, jeering, envious, and lurking to down him. He became just as wary and secretive with regard to them. But it was too much. At the end of the second year, several departures took place. The housekeeper went. The master always blamed self-important women most. The mason said he wasn't going to be monkeyed about anymore, so he took his departure with his family. The rheumatic farmhand left. And then the year's bills came in. The master made up his accounts. In spite of good crops, the assets were ridiculous against the spending. The island had again lost, not hundreds, but thousands of pounds. It was incredible, but you simply couldn't believe it. Where had it all gone? The master spent gloomy nights and days going through accounts in a library. He was thorough. It became evident now the housekeeper had gone that she had swindled him. Probably everybody was swindling him, but he hated to think it, so he put the thought away. He emerged, however, pale and hollow-eyed from his balancing of unbalanceable accounts, looking as if something had kicked him in the stomach. It was pitiable, but the money had gone, and there was an end of it. Another great hole in his capital. How could people be so heartless? It couldn't go on. That was evident. He would soon be bankrupt. He had to give regretful notice to his butler. He was afraid to find out how much his butler had swindled him. Because the man was such a wonderful butler after all. And the farm bailiff had to go. The master had no regrets in that quarter. The losses on the farm had almost embittered him. The third year was spent in rigid cutting down of expenses. The island was still mysterious and fascinating, but it was also treacherous and cruel, secretly, fathomlessly malevolent. In spite of all its fair show of white blossom and bluebells, and the lovely dignity of foxgloves bending their rose-red bells, it was your implacable enemy. With reduced staff, reduced wages, reduced splendour, the third year went by. but it was fighting against hope. The farm still lost a good deal, and once more there was a hole in that remnant of capital. Another hole in that which was already a mere remnant round the old holes. The island was mysterious in this also. It seemed to pick the very money out of your pocket, as if it were an octopus with invisible arms stealing from you in every direction. Yet the master still loved it, but with a touch of rancour now. He spent, however, the second half of the 4th year intensely working on the mainland to be rid of it, and it was amazing how difficult he found it to dispose of an island. He had thought that everybody was pining for such an island as his, but not at all. Nobody would pay any price for it. And he wanted now to get rid of it, as a man who wants a divorce at any cost. It was not till the middle of the 5th year that he transferred it, at a considerable loss to himself, to a hotel company who were willing to speculate in it. They were to turn it into a handy honeymoon and golf island. There, take that island which didn't know when it was well off. Now be a honeymoon and golf island. 2. The second island. The islander had to move, but he was not going to the mainland. Oh no. He moved to the smaller island which still belonged to him, and he took with him the faithful old carpenter and wife, the couple he had never really cared for, also a widow and daughter who had kept house for him the last year, also an orphan lad to help the old man. The small island was very small, but being a hump of rock in the sea, it was bigger than it looked. There was a little track among the rocks and bushes, winding and scrambling up and down around the islet, so that it took you 20 minutes to do the circuit. It was more than you would have expected. Still, it was an island. The islander moved himself with all his books into the commonplace 6-roomed house up to which you had to scramble from the rocky landing place. There were also 2 joined-together cottages. The old carpenter lived in one with his wife and the lad. The widow and daughter lived in the other. At last all was in order. The master's books filled 2 rooms. It was already autumn, Orion lifting out of the sea, and in the dark nights the master could see the lights on his late island, where the hotel company were entertaining guests who would advertise the new resort for honeymoon golfers. On his lump of rock, however, the master was still master. He explored the crannies, the odd handbreadths of grassy level, the steep little cliffs where the last harebells hung and the seeds of summer were brown above the sea, lonely and untouched. He peered down the old well. He examined the stone pen where the pig had been kept. Himself, he had a goat. Yes, it was an island. Always, always, underneath among the rocks, the Celtic sea sucked and washed and smote its feathery greyness. How many different noises of the sea! Deep explosions, rumblings, strange long sighs and whistling noises, then voices, real voices of people clamouring as if they were in a market under the waters, and again the far-off ringing of a bell, surely an actual bell. Then a tremendous trilling noise, very long and alarming, and an undertone of hoarse gasping. On this island there were no human ghosts, no ghosts of any ancient race. The sea and the spume and the weather had washed them all out, so there was only the sound of the sea itself, its own ghost, myriad-voiced, communing and plotting and shouting all winter long, and only the smell of the sea, with a few bristly bushes of gorse and coarse tufts of heather among the grey pellucid rocks in the grey, more pellucid air. The coldness, the greyness, even the soft creeping fog of the sea, and the islet of rock humped up in it all, like the last point in space. Green star Sirius stood over the sea's rim. The island was a shadow. Out at sea a ship showed small lights. Below, in the rocky cove, the rowing boat and the motor boat were safe. A light shone in the carpenter's kitchen. That was all. Save, of course, that the lamp was lit in the house, where the widow was preparing supper, her daughter helping. The islander went in to his meal. Here he was no longer the master. He was an islander again, and he had peace. The old carpenter, the widow and daughter were all faithfulness itself. The old man worked while ever there was light to see, because he had passion for work. The widow and her quiet, rather delicate daughter of 33 worked for the master, because they loved looking after him, and they were infinitely grateful for the haven he provided them. But they didn't call him the master. They gave him his name, Mr. Cathcart, sir, softly and reverently. And he spoke back to them also softly, gently, like people far from the world, afraid to make a noise. The island was no longer a world. It was a sort of refuge. The islander no longer struggled for anything. He had no need. It was as if he and his few dependents were a small flock of seabirds alighted on this rock as they travelled through space and keeping together without a word. The silent mystery of travelling birds. He spent most of his day in his study. His book was coming along. The widow's daughter could type out his manuscript for him. She was not uneducated. It was the one strange sound on the island, the typewriter. But soon even its spattering fitted in with the sea's noises and the winds. The months went by. The islander worked away in his study. The people of the island went quietly about their concerns. The goat had a little black kid with yellow eyes. There were mackerel in the sea. The old man went fishing in the rowboat with the lad when the weather was calm enough. They went off in the motorboat to the biggest island for the post, and they brought supplies, never a penny wasted, and the days went by, and the nights, without desire, without ennui. The strange stillness from all desire was a kind of wonder to the islander. He didn't want anything. His soul at last was still in him. His spirit was like a dim-lit cave under water, where strange sea foliage expands upon the watery atmosphere and scarcely sways, and a mute fish shadowy slips in and slips away again. All still and soft and uncrying, yet alive as rooted seaweed is alive. The islander said to himself, "Is this happiness?" He said to himself, "I'm turned into a dream. I feel nothing, or I don't know what I feel. Yet it seems to me I am happy." Only he had to have something upon which his mental activity could work. So he spent long silent hours in his study, working not very fast, nor very importantly, letting the writing spin softly from him, as if it were drowsy gossamer. He no longer fretted whether it were good or not, what he produced. He slowly, softly spun it like gossamer, and if it were to melt away as gossamer in autumn melts, he would not mind. It was only the soft evanescence of gossamy things which now seemed to him permanent. The very mist of eternity was in them, whereas stone buildings, cathedrals for example, seemed to him to howl with temporary resistance, knowing they must fall at last. The tension of their long endurance seemed to howl forth from them all the time. Sometimes he went to the mainland and to the city. Then he went elegantly dressed in the latest style to his club. He sat in a stall at the theatre. He shopped in Bond Street. He discussed terms for publishing his book. But over his face was that gossamy look of having dropped out of the race of progress which made the vulgar city people feel they had won it over him and made him glad to go back to his island. He didn't mind if he never published his book. The years were blending into a soft mist from which nothing obtruded. Spring came. There was never a primrose on his island, but he found a winter aconite. There were 2 little sprayed bushes of blackthorn and some windflowers. He began to make a list of the flowers of his islet, and that was absorbing. He noted a wild currant bush and watched for the elderflowers on a stunted little tree, then for the first yellow rags of the broom and wild roses. Bladder campion, orchids, stitchwort, celandine. He was prouder of them than if they had been people on his island. When he came across the golden saxifrage, so inconspicuous in a damp corner, he crouched over it in a trance he knew not for how long, looking at it. Yet it was nothing to look at, as the widow's daughter found when he showed it her. He had said to her in real triumph, "I found the golden saxifrage this morning." The name sounded splendid. She looked at him with fascinated brown eyes, in which was a hollow ache that frightened him a little. "Did you, sir? Is it a nice flower?" He pursed his lips and tilted his brows. "Well, not showy, exactly. I'll show it you, if you like. I should like to see it." She was so quiet, so wistful, but he sensed in her a persistency which made him uneasy. She said she was so happy, really happy. She followed him quietly like a shadow on the rocky track where there was never room for two people to walk side by side. He went first and could feel her there immediately behind him, following so submissively, gloating on him from behind. It was a kind of pity for her which made him become her lover, though he never realized the extent of the power she had gained over him and how she willed it. But the moment he had fallen, a jangling feeling came upon him that it was all wrong. He felt a nervous dislike of her. He had not wanted it, and it seemed to him, as far as her physical self went, she had not wanted it either. It was just her will. He went away and climbed at the risk of his neck down to a ledge near the sea. There he sat for hours, gazing all jangled at the sea and saying miserably to himself, "We didn't want it. We didn't really want it." It was the automism of sex that had caught him again. Not that he hated sex. He deemed it, as the Chinese do, one of the great life mysteries. But it had become mechanical, automatic, and he wanted to escape that. Automatic sex shattered him and filled him with a sort of death. He thought he had come through to a new stillness of desirelessness. Perhaps beyond that there was a new, fresh delicacy of desire, an unentered, frail communion of two people meeting on untrodden ground. Be that as it might, this was not it. This was nothing new or fresh. It was automatic and driven from the will. Even she, in her true self, hadn't wanted it. It was automatic in her. When he came home very late and saw her face white with fear and apprehension of his feeling against her, he pitied her and spoke to her delicately, reassuringly. But he kept himself remote from her. She gave no sign. She served him with the same silence, the same hidden hunger to serve him, to be near where he was. He felt her love following him with strange, awful persistency. She claimed nothing, yet now, when he met her bright brown, curiously vacant eyes, he saw in them a mute question. The question came direct at him with a force and a power of will he never realized. So he succumbed and asked her again. "Not," she said, "if it will make you hate me." "Why should it?" he replied, nettled. "Of course not. You know I would do anything on earth for you." It was only afterwards, in his exasperation, he remembered what she said and was more exasperated. Why should she pretend to do this for him? Why not herself? But in his exasperation, he drove himself deeper in. In order to achieve some sort of satisfaction, which he never did achieve, he abandoned himself to her. Everybody in the island knew, but he didn't care. Then even what desire he had left him, and he felt only shattered. He felt that only with her will had she wanted him. Now he was shattered and full of self-contempt. His island was smirched and spoiled. He had lost his place in the rare, desireless levels of time to which he had at last arrived, and he had fallen right back. If only it had been true, delicate desire between them, and a delicate meeting on the third rare place where a man might meet a woman, when they were both true to the frail, sensitive, crocus flame of desire in them. But it had been no such thing. Automatic, an act of will, not of true desire. It left him feeling humiliated. He went away from the islet in spite of her mute reproach, and he wandered about the continent, vainly seeking out a place where he could stay. He was out of key. He didn't fit in the world any more. There came a letter from Flora, her name was Flora, to say she was afraid she was going to have a child. He sat down as if he was shot, and he remained sitting, but he replied to her, "Why be afraid? If it is so, it is so, and we should be rather pleased than afraid." At this very moment, it happened, there was an auction of islands. He got the maps and studied them, and at the auction he bought, for very little money, another island. It was just a few acres of rock away in the north, on the outer fringes of the isles. It was low, it rose low out of the great ocean. There was not a building, not even a tree on it, only northern sea turf, a pool of rainwater, a bit of sedge, rock and seabirds. Nothing else, under the weeping, wet, western sky. He made a trip to visit his new possession. For several days, owing to the seas, he could not approach it. Then, in a light sea mist, he landed, and saw it hazy, low, stretching apparently a long way, but it was illusion. He walked over the wet, springy turf, and dark grey sheep tossed away from him, spectral, bleating hoarsely, and he came to the dark pool with the sedge. Then on in the dampness to the grey sea sucking angrily among the rocks. This was indeed an island. So he went home to Flora. She looked at him with guilty fear, but also with a triumphant brightness in her uncanny eyes. And again he was gentle. He reassured her. Even he wanted her again, with that curious desire that was almost like toothache. So he took her to the mainland, and they were married, since she was going to have his child. They returned to the island. She still brought him his meals, her own along with them. She sat and ate with him. He would have it so. The widowed mother preferred to stay in the kitchen, and Flora slept in the guest room of his house, mistress of his house. His desire, whatever it was, died in him with nauseous finality. The child would still be months coming. His island was hateful to him, vulgar, a suburb. He himself had lost all his finer distinction. The weeks passed in a sort of prison, in humiliation. Yet he stuck it out till the child was born. But he was meditating escape. Flora did not even know. A nurse appeared and ate at table with them. The doctor came sometimes. And if the sea were rough, he too had to stay. He was cheery over his whisky. They might have been a young couple in Golders Green. The daughter was born at last. The father looked at the baby and felt depressed, almost more than he could bear. The millstone was tied round his neck, but he tried not to show what he felt. And Flora didn't know. She still smiled with a kind of half-witted triumph in her joy as she got well again. Then she began again to look at him with those aching, suggestive, somehow impudent eyes. She adored him so. This he could not stand. He told her that he had to go away for a time. She wept, but she thought she had got him. He told her he had settled the best part of his property on her and wrote down for her what income it would produce. She hardly listened, only looked at him with those heavy, adoring, impudent eyes. He gave her a cheque-book with the amount of her credit duly entered. This did arouse her interest, and he told her if she got tired of the island, she could choose her home wherever she wished. She followed him with those aching, persistent brown eyes when he left, and he never even saw her weep. He went straight north to prepare his third island. The third island. The third island was soon made habitable. With cement and the big pebbles from the shingle beach, 2 men built him a hut and roofed it with corrugated iron. A boat brought over a bed and table, and 3 chairs with a good cupboard and a few books. He laid in a supply of coal and paraffin and food. He wanted so little. The house stood near the flat shingle bay where he landed, and where he pulled up his light boat. On a sunny day in August, the men sailed away and left him. The sea was still and pale blue. On the horizon, he saw the small mail steamer slowly passing northwards, as if she were walking. She served the outer isles twice a week. He could row out to her if need be, in calm weather, and he could signal her from a flagstaff behind his cottage. Half a dozen sheep still remained on the island as company, and he had a cat to rub against his legs. While the sweet sunny days of the northern autumn lasted, he would walk among the rocks and over the springy turf of his small domain, always coming to the ceaseless, restless sea. He looked at every leaf that might be different from another, and he watched the endless expansion and contraction of the water-tossed seaweed. He had never a tree, nor even a bit of heather to guard, only the turf and tiny turf plants and the sedge by the pool, the seaweed in the ocean. He was glad. He didn't want trees or bushes. They stood up like people, too assertive. His bare, low-pitched island in the blue, pale sea was all he wanted. He no longer worked at his book. The interest had gone. He liked to sit on the low elevation of his island and see the sea, nothing but the pale, quiet sea, and to feel his mind turn soft and hazy like the hazy ocean. Sometimes, like a mirage, he would see the shadow of land rise hovering to northwards. It was a big island beyond, but quite without substance. He was soon almost startled when he perceived the steamer on the near horizon, and his heart contracted with fear lest it were going to pause and molest him. Anxiously he watched it go, and not till it was out of sight did he feel truly relieved, himself again. The tension of waiting for human approach was cruel. He did not want to be approached. He did not want to hear voices. He was shocked by the sound of his own voice if he inadvertently spoke to his cat. He rebuked himself for having broken the great silence, and he was irritated when his cat would look up at him and mew faintly, plaintively. He frowned at her, and she knew. She was becoming wild, lurking in the rocks, perhaps fishing. But what he disliked most was when one of the lumps of sheep opened its mouth and baaed its hoarse, raucous baa. He watched it, and it looked to him hideous and gross. He came to dislike the sheep very much. He only wanted to hear the whispering sound of the sea and the sharp cries of the gulls, cries that came out of another world to him, and best of all, the great silence. He decided to get rid of the sheep when the boat came. They were accustomed to him now and stood and stared at him with yellow or colourless eyes in an insolence that was almost cold ridicule. There was a suggestion of cold indecency about them. He disliked them very much, and when they jumped with staccato jumps off the rocks and their hoofs made that dry, sharp hit and the fleece flopped on their square backs, he found them repulsive, degrading. The fine weather passed, and it rained all day. He lay a great deal on his bed, listening to the water trickling from his roof into the zinc water butt, looking through the open door at the rain, the dark rocks, the hidden sea. Many gulls were on the island now, many seabirds of all sorts. It was another world of life. Many of the birds he had never seen before. His old impulse came over him to send for a book, to know their names. In a flicker of the old passion, to know the names of everything he saw. He even decided to row out to the steamer. The names of these birds. He must know their names. Otherwise, he had not got them. They were not quite alive to him. But the desire left him, and he merely watched the birds as they wheeled or walked around him, watched him vaguely, without discrimination. All interest had left him. Only there was one gull, a big, handsome fellow, who would walk back and forth in front of the open door of the cabin, as if he had some mission there. He was big and pearl grey, and his roundnesses were as smooth and lovely as a pearl. Only the folded wings had shut black pinions, and on the closed black feathers were 3 distinct white dots making a pattern. The islander wondered very much why this bit of trimming on the bird out of the far cold seas, and as the gull walked back and forth in front of the cabin, strutting on pale dusky gold feet, holding up his pale yellow beak that was curved at the tip with curious alien importance, the man wondered over him. He was portentous. He had a meaning. Then the bird came no more. The island, which had been full of seabirds, the flash of wings, the sound and cut of wings and sharp eerie cries in the air, began to be deserted again. No longer they sat like living eggs on the rocks and turf, moving their heads but scarcely rising into flight around his feet. No longer they ran across the turf among the sheep and lifted themselves on low wings. The host had gone, but some remained, always. The day shortened and the world grew eerie. One day the boat came, as if suddenly swooping down, and the islander found it a violation. It was torture to talk to these two men in their homely, clumsy clothes. The air of familiarity around them was very repugnant to him. Himself, he was neatly dressed. His cabin was neat and tidy. He resented any intrusion. The clumsy homeliness, the heavy-footedness of these two fishermen was really repulsive to him. The letters they had brought he left lying unopened in a little box. In one of them was his money, but he could not bear to open even that one. Any kind of contact was repulsive to him, even to read his name on an envelope. He hid the letters away. And the hustle and horror of getting the sheep caught and tied and put in the ship made him loathe with profound repulsion the whole of animal creation. What repulsive god invented animals and evil-smelling men? To his nostrils, the fishermen and the sheep alike smelled foul, an uncleanness on the fresh earth. He was still nerve-racked and tortured when the ship at last lifted sail and was drawing away over the still sea. And sometimes, days after, he would start with repulsion, thinking he heard the munching of sheep. The dark days of winter drew on. Sometimes there was no real day at all. He felt ill, as if he were dissolving, as if dissolution had already set in inside him. Everything was twilight outside, and in his mind and soul. Once, when he went to the door, he saw the black heads of men swimming in his bay. For some moments he swooned unconscious. It was the shock, the horror of unexpected human approach, the horror in the twilight. And not till the shock had undermined him and left him disembodied did he realize that the black heads were the heads of seals swimming in. A sick relief came over him, but he was barely conscious after the shock. Later on he sat and wept with gratitude, because they were not men. But he never realized that he wept. He was too dim, like some strange ethereal animal. He no longer realized what he was doing. Only he still derived his single satisfaction from being alone, absolutely alone, with the space soaking into him, the grey sea alone, and the footing of his sea-washed island. No other contact, nothing human to bring its horror into contact with him, only space, damp, twilit, sea-washed space. This was the bread of his soul. For this reason, he was almost glad when there was a storm, or when the sea was high. Then nothing could get at him. Nothing could come through to him from the outer world. True, the terrific violence of the wind made him suffer badly. At the same time, it swept the world utterly out of existence for him. He had always liked the sea to be heavily rolling and tearing. Then no boat could get at him. It was like eternal ramparts round his island. He kept no track of time, and no longer thought of opening a book. The printed letters, so like the depravity of speech, looked obscene. He tore the brass label from his paraffin stove. He obliterated any bit of lettering in his cabin. His cat had disappeared. He was rather glad. He shivered at her thin, obtrusive call. She had lived in the coal shed, and each morning he had put her a dish of porridge, the same as he ate. He washed her saucer with repulsion. He did not like her writhing about, but he fed her scrupulously. Then, one day, she did not come for her porridge. She always mewed for it. She did not come again. He prowled about his island in the rain in a big oilskin coat, not knowing what he was looking at, nor what he went out to see. Time had ceased to pass. He stood for long spaces, gazing from a white, sharp face, with those keen, far-off blue eyes of his, gazing fiercely and almost cruelly at the dark sea under the dark sky. And if he saw the labouring sail of a fishing boat away on the cold waters, a strange, malevolent anger passed over his features. Sometimes he was ill. He knew he was ill because he staggered as he walked and easily fell down. Then he paused to think what it was, and he went to his stores and took out dried milk and malt and ate that. Then he forgot again. He ceased to register his own feelings. The days were beginning to lengthen. All winter the weather had been comparatively mild, but with much rain, much rain. He had forgotten the sun. Suddenly, however, the air was very cold, and he began to shiver. A fear came over him. The sky was level and grey, and never a star appeared at night. It was very cold. More birds began to arrive. The island was freezing. With trembling hands he made a fire in his grate. The cold frightened him. And now it continued, day after day, a dull, deathly cold. Occasional crumblings of snow were in the air. The days were greyly longer, but no change in the cold. Frozen grey daylight. The birds passed away, flying away. Some he saw lying frozen. It was as if all life were drawing away, contracting away from the north, contracting southwards. Soon, he said to himself, it will all be gone, and in all these regions nothing will be alive. He felt a cruel satisfaction at the thought. Then one night there seemed to be a relief. He slept better, did not tremble half awake and writhe so much half conscious. He had become so used to the quaking and writhing of his body he hardly noticed it, but when for once it slept deep, he noticed that. He woke in the morning to a curious whiteness. His window was muffled. It had snowed. He got up and opened his door and shuddered. Ah, how cold! All white with a dark leaden sea and black rocks curiously speckled with white. The foam was no longer pure. It seemed dirty, and the sea ate at the whiteness of the corpse-like land. Crumbles of snow were silting down the dead air. On the ground the snow was a foot deep, white and smooth and soft, windless. He took a shovel to clear round his house and shed. The pallor of morning darkened. There was a strange rumbling of far-off thunder in the frozen air, and through the newly falling snow a dim flash of lightning. Snow now fell steadily down in the motionless obscurity. He went out for a few minutes, but it was difficult. He stumbled and fell in the snow, which burned his face. Weak, faint, he toiled home, and when he recovered, he took the trouble to make hot milk. It snowed all the time. In the afternoon again there was a muffled rumbling of thunder, and flashes of lightning blinking reddish through the falling snow. Uneasy, he went to bed and lay staring fixedly at nothingness. Morning never seemed to come. An eternity long he lay and waited for one alleviating pallor on the night, and at last it seemed the air was paler. His house was a cell faintly illuminated with white light. He realized the snow was walled up outside his window. He got up in the dead cold. When he opened the door, the motionless snow stopped him in a wall as high as his breast. Looking over the top of it, he felt the dead wind slowly driving, saw the snow powder lift and travel like a funeral train. The blackish sea churned and champed, seeming to bite at the snow, impotent. The sky was grey, but luminous. He began to work in a frenzy to get at his boat. If he was to be shut in, it must be by his own choice, not by the mechanical power of the elements. He must get to the sea. He must be able to get at his boat. But he was weak, and at times the snow overcame him. It fell on him, and he lay buried and lifeless. Yet every time he struggled alive before it was too late and fell upon the snow with the energy of fever. Exhausted, he would not give in. He crept indoors and made coffee and bacon. Long since he had cooked so much. Then he went at the snow once more. He must conquer the snow, this new white brute force which had accumulated against him. He worked in the awful dead wind, pushing the snow aside, pressing it with his shovel. It was cold, freezing hard in the wind, even when the sun came out for a while and showed him his white, lifeless surroundings, the black sea rolling sullen, flecked with dull spume, away to the horizons. Yet the sun had power on his face. It was March. He reached the boat. He pushed the snow away, then sat down under the lee of the boat, looking at the sea, which swirled nearly to his feet in the high tide. Curiously natural the pebbles looked, in a world gone all uncanny. The sun shone no more. Snow was falling in hard crumbs, that vanished as if by a miracle as they touched the hard blackness of the sea. Hoarse waves rang in the shingle, rushing up at the snow. The wet rocks were brutally black, and all the time the myriad swooping crumbs of snow, demonish, touched the dark sea and disappeared. During the night there was a great storm. He seemed to hear the vast mass of snow striking all the world with a ceaseless thud, and over it all the wind roared in strange hollow volleys, in between which came a jump of blindfold lightning, then the low roll of thunder heavier than the wind. When at last the dawn faintly discoloured the dark, the storm had more or less subsided, but a steady wind drove on. The snow was up to the top of his door. Sullenly he worked to dig himself out, and he managed through sheer persistency to get out. He was in the tail of a great drift many feet high. When he got through, the frozen snow was not more than 2 feet deep, but his island was gone. Its shape was all changed. Great heaping white hills rose where no hills had been, inaccessible, and they fumed like volcanoes, but with snow powder. He was sickened and overcome. His boat was in another smaller drift, but he had not the strength to clear it. He looked at it helplessly. The shovel slipped from his hands, and he sank into the snow to forget. In the snow itself the sea resounded. Something brought him to. He crept to his house. He was almost without feeling. Yet he managed to warm himself, just that part of him which leaned in snow-sleep over a coal fire. Then again he made hot milk, after which carefully he built up the fire. The wind dropped. Was it night again? In the silence it seemed he could hear the panther-like dropping of infinite snow. Thunder rumbled nearer, crackled quick after the bleared reddened lightning. He lay in bed in a kind of stupor. The elements, the elements. His mind repeated the word dumbly. You can't win against the elements. How long it went on, he never knew. Once, like a wraith, he got out and climbed to the top of a white hill on his unrecognizable island. The sun was hot. It is summer, he said to himself, and the time of leaves. He looked stupidly over the whiteness of his foreign island, over the waste of the lifeless sea. He pretended to imagine he saw the wink of a sail, because he knew too well there would never again be a sail on that stark sea. As he looked, the sky mysteriously darkened and chilled. From far off came the mutter of the unsatisfied thunder, and he knew it was the signal of the snow rolling over the sea. He turned and felt its breath on him.